real conversations, and some hard truths. Gangs, drugs, and guns. Giving a voice to those willing to sacrifice. We have stories that need to be told. We have lessons that need to be taught. Protect and serve. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. All right, we're back with another one. It's Nathan Romas here, and today we're going to be talking with Michael Ewenson, the Executive Director for Alberta Serious Incident Response Team, or I guess more commonly known as ASIRT. To give you a bit of background on Mike, so he started his career with the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, and that was in Yellowknife in 2002. He was called to the bar in 2003, and he began working for, after that, he began working for the Alberta College of Physicians and Surgeons in Calgary and spent some time there. He then went on to become Deputy Chief Crown for Calgary in 2012. And a point I made specific reference we're going to get to with Mike is he took a year off to do his LLM in International Criminal Law, which is war crimes prosecution in Ireland, and that was in 2014. And then he started as the executive director for ASIRT, and that was December of 2021. Currently, that's where he's at, and he teaches evidence law at the University of Calgary. So welcome, Mike.
Thanks so much, Nathan. Thanks very much for having me on, for the introduction. And I'll just backtrack one part of it because I never realized that the acronym is actually the same for both. But ACPS was actually my time with the Alberta Crown Prosecution Service. Although, it could actually stand for College of Physicians and Surgeons. I'd never thought about that before, so I should have been a bit more clear about that. But.
Oh, no, you know what? I could have flipped you back an email there and asked, because I saw that and I was actually talking to someone recently about that and some investigations going on. I was like, oh, he was working there. So I just thought of that. So that's my fault. But no, thank you for being on. And hopefully have a good discussion today.
Yep, for sure. Happy to be on.
So if you could kind of start from the beginning, where we do with most of our guests the first time they're on. We'd like to get to know you and tell us a little bit about yourself. If you could kind of run through some of the points that I'd covered in your intro.
For sure. Thanks for that. I guess I've become a bit of a Calgary guy in life. I wasn't born and raised here. I really grew up in Revelstoke, BC, but at some point my parents had moved to Calgary, so it's become home base. But I did law school at New Brunswick and finished that up there, and then didn't really want to know what I wanted to do with a legal career, so I went and didn't show this on the resume, but worked for half a year in South Africa, and which was a great experience. And once that was all said and done with, I realized, well, I got to start paying off some student loans. So that's when I found the job in Yellowknife and went up there to work with the Federal Prosecution Service. And at that point, I'd never had any expectations of working in criminal law. It wasn't something that I found that enjoyable to study in law school, but I guess I'm more of a courtroom guy. I really liked everything that goes on in the courtroom. And my uncle was a police officer in Montreal, so I've always had that respect for policing, and really liked working with the RCMP up in Yellowknife and the close relationship we had with them. So really, when I got called to the bar, they said, well, we've got a spot if you want to be a criminal prosecutor. And I said, for sure. So spent the first couple of years up there, and as a young single guy with no family to be tied down to, I was spending every second week on a Twin Otter, flying around to the communities in the north, doing court on the circuit court rotation. A great experience. I really saw the benefit of community policing and the relationship that the RCMP had with the local communities up there. And so did that for a few years, but real estate in Yellowknife has always been really expensive, and that's what I had to make the decision: is that going to become home, settle down, or was I going to move back to Calgary where my parents were? And made the decision to come back to Calgary, and in that sense, the rest is history. Got a great job down here working with the Alberta Crown Prosecution Service, and started working hand in hand with CPS, and saw the great work that a lot of their investigators were doing on stuff, and was really stimulating. So I did that for quite a few years, and became deputy chief of the office at one point, which was a great opportunity. And then, as you mentioned there at the intro, the war crime studies and doing my master's, I got to the point where I had a really understanding boss, and my wife and I talked, and we had just one son at the time. He was 2 years old. And we thought, geez, if we're ever going to go overseas and going to take up that opportunity, now is the time. And so I got to leave the absence and went over to Ireland and studied for a year. So did that, came back and prosecuted a bit more, and then the ACERT gig became open and fell into that. So that's a life story in 30 seconds or so.
And you teach. So you apparently have a lot of time, right? You got the family on the go, and you're teaching, and you're doing the ACERT work. Yeah,
I found the teaching great. It's when I got back with the masters, the law school reached out. They like most of their profs, so I guess I'd be technically called a sessional lecturer. But they like those individuals to have masters in law, even if it doesn't directly relate to what they're teaching. And they had an opening for an evidence professor, and being teaching evidence, it covers all manners of evidence, both civil and criminal. But the vast majority of the case law is criminal based. That's where all the litigation occurs for the most part. So it was an easy fit, and so I spoke with them and said, "Look, all I really can give you is night class hours," and they were very understanding. So I did it for a year, and it was really, really stimulating. Really, really enjoyed it, but a lot of work. But I felt it really helped my career as well because I was keeping current with the law, so it really trickled down to what I was doing as a prosecutor. And so, I did that, and then took a couple years off from doing it, and then did it again last year, and I'll be starting again to teach this semester. So it's nice to see because some of the students that I taught when I first did it, now they're lawyers, and so they become colleagues. And so it's sort of nice to see their development in criminal law, and I'll bring in guest lecturers and so forth. And so it's been a good experience. But it is pretty busy. So fit that in with my son's hockey practices, and then just teach one term of it and take it easy in January, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty cool aspect to any job, especially if you're a really motivated person. You want to see kind of the fruits of your labor. So when you get to, pass on the knowledge and the wisdom and then see that person grow. So same as having kids, I guess it'd be, you have your students and they go on to bigger and better things, hopefully.
Yeah, that's exactly it. There's a couple that are actually prosecutors in our office in Calgary, or I guess I should say my old office now that with ACERT. But they went through my class, and now they're out prosecuting. And there's been times when I've been talking to homicide investigators, about some aspects, and I realized that any advice I'm giving them on the areas of evidence is actually stuff I picked up while preparing for my course. So there's really that side benefit to it that's been really, really good.
So most of your stuff has been on the prosecution side, from what I understand. Did you do any work as defense?
No, I haven't. I've got no. Obviously, everybody appreciates a really good defense lawyer, and there's a very important role for defense in society. So I've never had anything, ethically or psychologically against doing it. I really enjoyed my career advancement at the Crown's office, and it got to the point where I became deputy chief, where I thought, well, if I ever want to do defense work, open my own shop, be my own boss, which of course all has its advantages, then that was really the time. And I really liked where my career was going within Alberta Crown Prosecution Service. So it's just not an opportunity I took up. And now, at this point in my career, it's just not something I'd look to be doing. I really am enjoying working with ACERT right now. And so not looking too far in the future, just really want to spend my time on that organization.
So we'll maybe kind of go back a little bit to the beginning and talk about your time with the Public Prosecution Service. So can you explain for the listeners kind of what that is, and when you say you're doing the circuit, how that kind of works? For sure.
So, use Alberta as an example. You've got your federal prosecutors and your provincial, Crown prosecutors with the Alberta government. And of course, we know the provinces have jurisdiction over prosecuting criminal law, and then the federal prosecutors, primarily, you'll see them in court dealing with drug prosecutions. Up in the Northwest Territories, it's a little different because, of course, a territory isn't a province. And so there's no territorial prosecution agency. So the feds up there at Yellowknife prosecute everything. So when I went up there, you head to court, you might be prosecuting a possession for the purpose of trafficking trial one day, and the next day you're dealing with domestic violence or sex assault or something like that. So they cover everything. And so that was really my time spent with them, was first articling, which was doing a little bit of everything, and then as a prosecutor, just handling all the different prosecutions they had going on. Pardon me, I'm dealing with a bit of a throat cold, so I'll apologize in advance, Nathan, for any coughs I have here.
Yeah, no,
but
all good.
And then the circuit court was there was one office in Yellowknife, and then another one up in the Nubik. And the Nubik had one prosecutor, so Yellowknife was the main prosecution office. I think we had, at the time, 14 or 15 prosecutors. And so we'd prosecute the offenses in Yellowknife. But it's important that justice be seen to be done in the communities as well. So because there's very limited road access in the Northwest Territories, we would have court out in all the local communities. And so I would travel with the judge, with a legal aid public defender, the court clerk, and the other staff, and we would hop in the Twin Otter and spend a week just bouncing around the north from one community to the other, holding court. So that was the circuit court.
That's pretty cool. I think maybe it doesn't sound great to a lot of people, always being in the air or on the road, but having been with the Mounties before, and I've traveled to several communities in Alberta just to do different investigations or files, but when you're actually out there doing that stuff, it is pretty neat. You don't realize just what goes on in the rest of the world. You know, most people are stuck in their little bubble.
Yeah. You don't realize how much of Canada exists, up north, really. We're so used to most of our population hugging the border of the United States. But you get way up to, Tuktoyaktuk, or, I got as far as Holman Island. I think it's called by a different name now. It's referred to its indigenous name. But it's you fly about an hour or so from Tuktoyaktuk north to one of the islands up in the Arctic. And it's just amazing to see how far Canada reaches and the unique culture that's up there. And as you alluded to with your time at the Mounties, just the importance of the relationship with the police in those communities, because oftentimes, they're it in terms of, having that sort of community structure. You might have a nurse, a couple Mounties, and so they become a really important part of the community up there. And so I just love doing it. It was a bit of a hard lifestyle because, you're bouncing around. The hotel facilities obviously aren't the best. I never had computer access at the time that I did it in one of those communities. So you went in and prosecuted with paper and had to, have your own independence and sort of think on your feet. But it was a wonderful way to see communities in the northern Canada that, I knew I would never get to as a tourist.
Well, and I guess from your viewpoint now, being with ACERT, if you kind of reflect back to that time of being up in the north, can you kind of describe the relationship between the Mounties or any other local police and the communities? Because my own experience with the Mounties was that you're way more ingrained in the community. Like you're saying, they don't have a lot of resources or services up there. So you have to fill a lot of different roles, which is much different than when you're policing in a large municipality. You're in the big city, you're much more detached, but you also have a lot of different services. So just with a lot of the narratives going on about, people saying they don't necessarily want police in a certain community, or there's the history of the relationships there. What was kind of your experience in looking back on that?
Well, I felt that it was a really positive experience. I mean, there's nothing wrong with officers, in my view, not living in the community that they're policing in, right? Because they get to know the community through their shift work and through those relationships they create. But with Mounties in those small communities, they had no choice. Like, they were definitely living within these small communities, and they would come in for, say, a 2 or 3 year rotation. And so right away, they're the new guy or gal in town. And it was, I always felt it was an overwhelming positive relationship because they got to know the people and they got to engage in what truly was community policing. That not everything related to an investigation or an arrest. They got to know the personalities. In domestic situations, they were able to lend a hand without laying a charge by talking through some aspects of it. So, yeah, I think, and I can't speak from personal experience because I obviously wasn't a Mountie. I was just a prosecutor that would fly in and out. But I formed really good friendships with a lot of the Mounties that were up there. And obviously, it takes a toll on a person because then you're kind of policing 24/7. When there's really no anonymity. Yeah. So, your weekend off, unless you're grabbing a flight out of a small community, when you're walking around, everybody knows you. And so you have to be prepared in terms of mental health to sort of always be recognized and be there and then being called for assistance in that aspect. But the community knowledge was amazing. And when we were able to fly into a community a little bit in advance and speak with the local officers, we could say, what's the problems in the community? How is so-and-so doing on probation? Or how is this family doing that's had some issues with alcohol and domestic violence? and they'd have that inherent knowledge, and so they were able to give back a lot just by understanding the community that well, which really is really only capable in those small communities where you're sort of living right with the people that you're policing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. No, and I would say that's 100% correct from just my own experience, having been in a lot of those smaller communities. So from there, you moved to Calgary and you're there for quite a while. What was kind of your experience, and how would you contrast that with doing the Yellowknife circuit?
It was eye-opening. You march in the court in Yellowknife, and what judge you have, the defense lawyer, all the officers, and so it was very familiar. So there's a lot of things that you might have to navigate or worry about in a big city that you didn't in Yellowknife.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to find my way, understanding a larger police force, larger office processes, and so forth. But I had good mentorship, and really, I just sort of felt the first thing I had to do was build relationships. So get to know defense counsel, get to know the judges, get to know everybody in the office, and then not be too hard on myself in terms of that learning curve. And then really, after that, I was lucky enough to be paired with some senior prosecutors on some large files. So I just really learned from them. And that was something that wasn't as possible in Yellowknife. The office certainly did its best, but when you have a smaller office and people out on circuit court and so forth, the mentorship opportunities aren't as great just because they don't have the staff to do it. Whereas we had a larger office in Calgary, so we had better learning opportunities with the senior crown. So I got on some large files and got to know, some really good detectives with the Calgary Police Service. And so I'd say, after a few years, I really sort of felt like I had a good footing. And then after that, I just felt I didn't want to leave. I really enjoyed living in Calgary, enjoyed Alberta, and turned out to be a pretty promising career.
Well, I imagine the sheer volume of calls would be much different.
Yeah.
When you compare anywhere in the territories to Calgary. So you're learning a lot more by doing, I guess, more hands-on with different types of files.
100%. Yeah, that's a perfect point, actually, Nathan, is, unfortunately, in the Northwest Territories, I'd say, I don't have a pie graph in front of me, but I think it's a pretty safe guesstimate to say like over half is alcohol related,
Mm-hmm.
domestic violence.
Yeah.
And just it's tragic. So, you do your best and you understand that area of the law well, and you develop a good understanding of how to speak to people who've been victimized and try to assist them with the court process, sometimes successfully, sometimes, you do your best and it doesn't work out. But you don't have too many bank robberies or insurance frauds or, crimes of that nature, sophisticated crimes.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of alcohol related violence, whether it's domestic or not. And so getting down to the big city, all of a sudden, you've got, at the time, a full staffed impaired driving prosecution unit, for example, which is something we would never have in the North. You've got people working with tech crimes. And so a lot of different areas where, you can sort of see what interests you and then go down that path. So you're quite right. It's a much greater variety in a large city. So there's those opportunities to really learn how to prosecute different files, how to deal with different areas of evidence, and create relationships with the different units with CPS that had expertise in those areas of crimes.
So then from Calgary, you said you had taken this year off to do the LLM. What can you say what that stands for?
Sure. Yeah, so that's just a master's in law.
Oh, okay.
So now they call it, I think for a regular law degree, I think they've changed the terminology to call it Juris Doctor, but that's the old way they used to call it was an LLB. And so a Bachelor of Laws, and then the Master of Laws is the LLM.
Okay, so what did you do for this program?
So, long story made short, right when I graduated from law school, there was an institute that was created in Ireland, and it was created around the same time that the International Criminal Court was created. And it was staffed by a Canadian by the name of William Shabas, who's a really well-known scholar in war crimes, genocide, and so forth. One of the leading experts in the world, and just so happens he's from Canada. So he was the head of this institute in Ireland, and I really wanted to go and do my master's at that time. But, student loans being what they were, and having lived outside of the house for both undergraduate and law school, I just didn't have the money. It just didn't make sense. And so that's why I sort of embarked on the brief trip to South Africa and then worked up in Yellowknife. But it was always a dream that sort of sat at the back of my mind. And I told my wife about it. So she was very supportive of it. And so like I had mentioned there previously, we sort of said, okay, Our son's two, just turned 2 years old. My boss was supportive. So we just asked for a leave of absence to go over to Ireland and study at that same institute, albeit, many, many years later. And, I got accepted, and my boss at the time in Calgary was remarkably supportive. So we really just took a year off and did that master's in that area of international criminal law.
So were you practicing, were you actually doing trials with people that had committed war crimes?
No, it was a purely academic experience, and so I was just over there getting the degree. And so getting the degree allows me, if I ever want to in the future, embark upon those sort of prosecutions. It was a year of study with some classes. We traveled to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. We had instructors that had prosecuted and judges, in fact, that had been judging trials both in the Rwandan and Yugoslavian tribunals.
Wow.
So it's a fantastic learning experience. And, it's selfishly, like, who doesn't enjoy an Irish pub, right? So it was a great year off, really, really stimulating. And then at the end of it, we just sort of gave some thought of what do we want to do? And we realized, we wanted to expand our family and live in Calgary a bit longer. So came back here with a degree.
All right. So that brings us up to your time now with ACERT.
Mm-hmm.
You're the executive director. And what is your current role? What do you do on a day-to-day?
So I guess I'm the best way to put it, I guess, would be the head of the organization, and technically the civilian in terms of embodying the principle of civilian oversight. So I operate out of Calgary, but do travel up to Edmonton quite often. I have an assistant executive director who's a former prosecutor out of Calgary and a friend of mine by the name of Matt Block. And so he's also occupies a civilian role. And then after that, we have, in terms of our hierarchy, we've got a director of investigations who operates out of Edmonton but oversees all the investigators. And then investigating managers and investigators below that. So I would run the organization sort of in the hierarchy of government that just below assistant deputy minister. And so I just sort of make the calls with the organization in conjunction with the great staff I have working there. And on a day-to-day basis, really what ACERT does is the investigators are either seconded police members. We have seconded EPS members, CPS members, and RCP members. And also what we would call Government of Alberta employees who are retired officers who just purely work for ACERT. And they do something a bit different compared to regular policing. All they do is investigate and accumulate facts. So an officer with EPS may form an opinion in witnessing an event and lay a charge. Officers with ACERT won't lay the charge. They just accumulate the facts. And then that goes to the civilian oversight branch for legal review, which is myself, as well as my assistant executive director and another legal counsel. And then we would make the determination as to whether or not the file should go to prosecution or an officer be cleared.
Okay. Well, so when, I guess, there's a lot of discussion right now about civilians overseeing police or police investigating themselves. Can you kind of walk us through that narrative and what you might foresee as maybe a perfect world scenario, what there might be in the end for oversight? Sure.
So, the civilian oversight model really started in Ontario with their special investigation unit. And so they've been doing it for a while. But ACERT has one of the best mandates and most encompassing mandates. But, to be clear, we're not called out on a daily basis to investigate any time a civilian, points a finger at an officer and says, I think they've done something wrong. So in my view, EPS, CPS, the RCP, and the other police forces in Alberta do an excellent job investigating their own, issues that may crop up. ACERT becomes involved when our mandate was triggered, where something is serious or sensitive, or an individual suffers bodily harm or death at the hands of the police. And to be clear, it may be entirely justified. An officer may shoot in self-defense, but ACERT's still going to get called out. We don't choose our own investigations, so we are never in a situation where we can self-direct. So I can never actually say, look, I think we need to investigate. I saw a shooting on the news. We're going to take this on. Instead, we're directed to investigate by the Director of Law Enforcement. And so when we are directed to investigate, then we deploy a team, and that team goes and accumulates the facts. And as I said, then passes it off to me in terms of making a determination. I think it's important for public confidence. it's not so much the situation of the police not getting it right when they investigate their own. It's, will the public tolerate that, right? And so in that sense, it's important to have an organization like ACERT. So when we do clear an officer and say, look, this officer fired in self-defense, the affected person had a weapon, the officer had no choice. Sometimes if the police investigate themselves, a member of the public might say, well, you know what, they're just covering for themselves. But if ACERT's doing it, we're able to say, look, we're independent. And the facts were accumulated. A civilian has come to this conclusion. This officer fired in self-defense. They're not going to be charged. And it's the hope and the idea behind ACERT and other organizations across Canada that have them, because many provinces have similar models, that when those determinations are made, then the public's able to say, okay, we trust that determination, which hopefully is a benefit, not just to the public, but to the police officers as well.
Well, and even on that, so one of the things that just I personally have never really understood about the whole argument about whether it's police or civilians that do the oversight part, or even the investigations for that matter, but the narrative about police are just protecting themselves or their buddy and covering things up. You can still be friends with a civilian. So to me, that argument doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I can still hang out with the civilian person on days off, and we could be best friends from grade one. Like those relationships can still exist. So I just find that in the end, a lot of it is kind of like a utopian narrative where it's like, well, but we're humans and we're not perfect. And as long as people, whether it's police or civilians, doing the oversight, that there's just some accountability and we can present the facts and say, this is what happened, this is what we looked at, and this is the decision we made.
Exactly. Yeah. And ACERT's decision-making process is very transparent, because what I do is when I formulate a report, I write it up and then we release it to the public. We don't include names. So we don't name subject officers or witness officers. We just use acronyms, SO or WO, and we don't name the affected person. So there is that privacy within it, but we do list all the facts. And, I put my name at the end of it in terms of my determination. And then that goes out to the public. And so, when we do clear an officer, we can say, here's what we've determined. Here's the facts as we see them of what occurred. And here's why it's my determination that, for example, an officer either is charged or not charged. And so we lay that out to the public in terms of that transparency. And I think when, if they spend the time and read those reports, they realize that, policing is a remarkably difficult job. We have seen, obviously, an increase in firearms on the street. And at the end of the day, if somebody has an issue with it, they can go through the legal reasoning and, and see why we got to the point that we did.
Can you comment a bit on maybe how, so you see a lot of the stuff in the US right now. Can you comment on how there are the differences, I should say, between maybe the US side of things and their accountability for police, and then contrast that with Canada and how we handle things?
Well, from what I understand, in the States, there's various levels of police forces. And so, you might have a small town sheriff. You've got different levels at the state level, at the federal level. And so it's kind of stratified. Whereas in Canada, our oversight is significant. It's all entrenched in legislation. So we have one process alone in terms of ACERT being deployed in Alberta. BC has their own process. Ontario has their own process, but it's all processes based on legislation and sort of a one size fit all across. And so in Alberta, for example, ACERT has jurisdiction over every officer, whether they be with EPS, CPS, RCMP, Medicine Hat, Lethbridge. You're not getting different levels or different organizations on a community standpoint that are employing that oversight. So, of course, each individual organization, if they're dealing with a matter that hasn't hit ACERT's mandate, may have their own processes, and they certainly will. But ACERT employs the same process province-wide. So every Albertan will see that these reports come out. We're using the same reasoning, the same standard of law, the same fact-finding, and the same major case investigation protocols for every officer across the province. So there's that uniformity within one province, whereas in the United States, from what I understand, it's very much more jurisdiction specific in terms of various levels of policing that you may see.
Do you think, and I ask this because some of the stuff in the States now, they're very quick to put out details of an investigation or what happened. As soon as they think they can put a piece of information out, they're putting it out there. Do you think we would ever be able to move towards something like that? Because, the reason I ask too is because I had Kim Bolan, a gang reporter from Vancouver, on,
Mhm.
and that was one of her points was the police need to share more information. Whether it's the names of victims or why this shooting took place or who's involved. So, are we at a point where we can move towards something like that if we even want to move to that?
So we do somewhat already. And so what ACERT will do is we have memorandums of understanding with the various police forces. And so even if EPS want to release information, they're going to reach out to us if ACERT's investigating to get our okay. And what we are guided by are really two principles. One, we want to maintain public confidence. And so if we have a situation where, and we've done in the past, where we can verify right off the get-go that the person who was fatally shot by an officer was armed with a handgun, for example. And then instead of letting the rumor mill go crazy and social media doing the evils that it can do in terms of getting the wrong narrative out there, we may release a photo of that gun and say ACERT's investigating, but an affected person was shot and killed, and they were armed with a handgun. And here's a picture of the handgun. And we've done that in various investigations. But what we are guided by is, one, that we want to make sure that that is a fact. And so if, for example, we're not sure or we haven't interviewed everybody, then we're not going to send out that information because it's improper, because we haven't reached that formal conclusion yet. And the fact finding is most important. The second principle that we're governed by in those situations is that if we think there's other civilian witnesses that may be out there, the last thing we want to do is to taint their recollection or their evidence. And so just like any normal investigation, you're not going to have EPS necessarily, if they're not sure about a fact or they know there's other witnesses out there that might come forward, they don't want to say, hey, the guy who robbed the bank, was wearing a red hoodie. If they want other witnesses to come forward and give them that evidence, they don't want to taint the recollection of the public. And so there's times when we won't release information because we want to make sure we're getting it from the witness first and foremost, instead of them hearing it third or fourth hand. And so that's just, normal evidence collection rules. But there certainly are times when we will release information as soon as we can once it's verified. You raised the point about getting names out there in terms of victims and so forth. Our protocol regarding that is the same across the country with other agencies. And we just simply don't name the names of victims that are shot. And certainly, if they're injured, they can name themselves to the media. And the family certainly can come forward and provide those names. But we won't do it because I want to provide them some privacy for their grieving process. If they wish to reach out to the media, defense counsel, whatever it may be, we can never bind them to silence.
Yeah.
And I will never in a meeting with a family say, please don't give out this information. It's a free country. They can talk to whoever they want. But we're not going to come out and name those people unless it's a very odd circumstance where we think that we have to name them because it may assist in the public's understanding. But if it's just a random person on the street, it's not going to enhance public understanding of the shootings for these the name. And it can do the family grave damage in terms of their healing process.
Yeah, and kind of to your point that you're saying about not tainting what a witness might say, I just know from the hundreds of investigations and the thousands of people I've talked to over my 10 years, witnesses are actually very bad at recalling stuff. Stuff can happen 10 seconds before you show up, and they'll tell you the person had a red jacket when they had a blue one. And it could be clear as day, but just the way the human mind works and what you actually focus on when you're in a stressful event or something is, just going on. Who knows what you're looking at, what you're listening to. People are actually very bad with their details. And then when you see that kind of transition into the reporting side, because we as police can't stop them from going to the media, but then they tell the media a wild story. Well, I think that's on the police side of things. That's where police get frustrated, and they just get kind of frustrated with the reporting. And you're like, well, that's not what happened. So why, whether it's ACERT or just our own bosses, why aren't they out there putting the narrative out? Okay, these people said this. Now we need to come back with, the other side of things. That might be a pretty huge task considering how many news agencies and social media there are. But I think that from a ground perspective, that's what the day-to-day officer, that's what they're kind of looking for, is that defense of what they're doing and the truth.
Exactly. And, at the end of the day, we'll always be governed by, the best rules of evidence collection, because we want to get to the facts. Because if at the end of the day, either an officer's, one of two things, an officer's either cleared by ACERT or we send it on for prosecution, we want to make sure either of those determinations is totally appropriate. And we only get to that point with getting the proper facts. And you're only going to get the proper facts when you treat the evidence collection appropriately. And so we're always mindful of that with news releases, especially early on in the investigation, because as you mentioned, there's a frailty of civilian witnesses in terms of what they may have seen or what they believe to have seen. And once information gets out and they read this in the newspaper, how good is a witness statement after that fact? And so, as I mentioned earlier, it's a situation where we can verify something right away and there'll be assistance to the public in terms of understanding why something may have occurred, then we have no problem releasing that information. But the investigation obviously will always come first in terms of making sure that it's dialed in.
And since I got the lawyer on the line here, maybe I'll ask, can you, because I don't think the public realizes this, but can you explain a bit about the amount of oversight that there is for a police officer and the rules or acts that they're governed by, as opposed to a regular everyday civilian who basically has either the civil law or the criminal law. You're either charged with something or you're getting sued. But police have further acts such as a police act. Can you kind of talk about the structure of oversight for police?
Sure. So specifically with the ACERT, which is really my, we'll call it area of expertise. I'm new in the role and learning new stuff every day, but it's a fascinating job. But we're tied into oversight via Section 46.1 of the Police Act. And so what happens is if an incident occurs and a member of the police force, senior member of the police force who's got the duty to report, knows that something has occurred, they will notify the Director of Law Enforcement under 46.1. And then the determination is made, is it in scope or out of scope? And so if something's out of scope, it might be, say, someone who self-harms. An officer may be nearby, but the person has self-harmed. And so although an officer is dealing with this individual, they haven't laid a hand on them. There's been no use of force or anything along those lines. And so it may be deemed out of scope. But there may be other situations where, for example, it's a tragic in custody death and cell death where somebody ODs. And we might say, well, that's going to be in scope because the person was brought into custody. They were sitting in a jail cell being dealt with by police, and this death occurred. So then ACERT's deployed to determine the facts and then to understand whether or not there's any breach of criminal law that would be deserving of prosecution. And so the Police Act, governs all the police officers within the province of Alberta, and that's really where ACERT gets its power to investigate. If something is out of scope and ACERT isn't deployed, it can still stay with the home agency for investigation. And then, of course, there's their own professional standards branches in the various police forces that all have their own acronyms that will investigate and deal with matters along those lines. When ACERT's done an investigation, even when it doesn't result in charges, it can go to a Fatality Act inquiry. And so there, as much as it doesn't assign blame, it's a situation where there may be recommendations in terms of how police forces can improve an aspect of the service they provide to the community to make sure something like a tragic event doesn't occur again.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of oversight, a lot of layers to it.
No, there certainly is. I think that's something the public really doesn't understand, is that there's a huge amount of oversight in Canada, and the public needs to understand that that all exists for the benefit of confidence in policing. And when you travel around the world, and not to besmirch other countries, but when you land back in Canada, I think most Canadians, when they're educated on the amount of oversight and the quality of policing in Canada, are thankful to live in this country.
Mm-hmm. Well, so can you go over a bit of the statistics for ACERT, such as how many files you guys take in a year, what your clearance rate is, or if you could define that, and just how long investigations might take and why they take that long?
Sure. So, I mean, first off, the investigations take too long, and that's not me criticizing my own team of investigators. They are amazing. It's simply that ACERT saw a real jump in the amount of files we're taking in probably the last 5 to 6 years. So, ACERT was formed in 2008, and then as it sort of got its feet under it and got rolling, for the first 4 or 5 years, just to give you ballpark figures here, there might be 35 files that we take a year. Then from about 2015, 2016 onwards, we jumped up to an average of 75 to 80 files a year. What didn't occur when that jump in files, when the doubling of files more or less occurred, is that there was no doubling of budget or staff. And I love working for government. Obviously, I've spent a career doing it, but that's one of the frustrations is that when you're in private industry, if you recognize a need, you can reorganize, generate more revenue, possibly hire more staff. But ACERT can't do that on its own volition, right? And so we have to get the budget increases. My predecessor in the role was a very loyal and fierce advocate for ACERT, and brought that situation to the government's attention. He said, look, ACERT's starting to drown here. When ACERT starts to drown in terms of the number of files, there's a negative effect on a lot of people. There's a negative effect on the public in terms of confidence in policing. It's a negative effect on subject officers who may have their career on hold. Negative effect on affected people and their families. So at the end of the day, in the last budget, we received a $1.4 million increase, which allows ACERT to get a lot more staff. And so we're going to use that to improve our clearance rate. But right now, I think we're on track for probably getting about 65 files this year. So we can clear some of these quickly. Sometimes, we're deployed to investigate, there's CCTV or in Calgary body-worn camera footage, for example, and we're able to look at it and say, this officer's going to be cleared right away, and we can come to that conclusion. But that still demands a public report that has to go out. So, we're trying to improve our clearance rate, but we do have files that have been active now for a number of years.
On the body camera thing, do you guys have any input on whether police services, I guess even just more general, have any input on the training that police services do, but the equipment they use?
No, we don't. No. So I can tell you, I know Calgary has them, Edmonton doesn't. To me, those are political decisions. They're budgetary decisions. It's an expensive program. Mm-hmm. I think the views of officers that would be wearing them are very, very important because, they're going on an officer's body. And so at the end of the day, I think, the EPA's viewpoints need to be really heard on that as well, because, it's ultimately part of the equipment that an officer would be asked to use, and extra training is required. Mm-hmm. Selfishly, of course, with ACERT, we want as much evidence as we can get our hands on so that we know that we're coming to the proper facts. And extra video is extra video. So it is remarkably helpful to our investigations, but that's, my selfish ACERT viewpoint. But I think at the end of the day, it's really, it's up to individual police forces and the budget and the community. If the community says, look, this is important enough to us, we've elected our city councillors, this is what we want them to spend money on, then I think there's going to be a conversation with police union and the police service itself, and then the determination whether you go forward on those. But they have been helpful in these certain investigations, that's for sure.
And on kind of the end of the investigation, how do you consider a file concluded or cleared for stats purposes? Say we did this many files in a year.
So the easy answer on that is, if we're clearing an officer, what will happen is the investigator will complete a report and they'll say, okay, all investigative avenues have been tied off. We have all the evidence we think we could legitimately get in this file. Here's the factual determination of what occurred. Then it goes to the legal counsel side, where I review those facts, and myself or my assistant executive director or our other legal counsel would write a report and look at the law and say, okay, was it an offense? Is it reasonable to conclude an offense occurred here or not? And then we do that. And if we clear an officer, what we do is I publish that report. It goes up on our website. We don't publish them all. So if it's something more private domestic matter or sexual assault, there hasn't been a media release on it, we may not send it out for privacy reasons. For example, if it's a fatal shooting, an officer involved shooting, that would definitely be going out to the public. And so we publish that report and would say search investigations concluded. And then that would be it. That would be a definition of concluding a file. If, on the other hand, it's a file where we believe it needs to go to prosecution, and then we write our report and we send it off to the Alberta Crown Prosecution Service, where they will make a determination whether or not the file meets their standard for prosecution. And then those ASERT investigators become witnesses, basically like any officer would become a witness in a file they investigated, and it'll go down that route. And so, we might not determine it, formally concluded because it's an active file in court, but ASERT's job is done aside from testifying and presenting evidence.
Okay. So what's kind of the, maybe wrapping up the ASERT side of things, but what is the future of ASERT? Where do you see police accountability going? And if is it going to be all civilianized? Is it going to be more police, or is it just we're going to maintain kind of a mix?
So it's an interesting question because, for example, in British Columbia, there's civilian investigators that work with their oversight branch, and so they would not be allowed to have, for example, seconded members, whereas we do. I'm in favor of the ASERT model because really, why wouldn't you want the best people investigating? And the best people that are investigating files are trained investigators with police forces. So we'll always have those investigators, but the ASERT model in terms of civilian oversight won't be changing. And so, you'll always have an executive director that will be a civilian offering the final conclusion based on the facts that the investigator presents. So specifically for ASERT, what we're doing with our budget increase is, given that we're seeing that many more call-outs, we're hiring, or in the process, I should say, of 3 new investigators in Edmonton and 2 in Calgary. And that's going to enable, that's important for a few reasons. When we have more investigators, that means that when there's a call-out, we have more people to send out, but we also have other investigators that can stay in the office and conclude their investigations and their reports. So that will speed up our timeline. And it's also important for our current investigators' mental health because it's not, an ideal situation. And this isn't an ASERT-specific problem. This would be a problem in any investigative unit, in any police force. You can't keep calling out the same people at 3 a.m. and asking them to work a 24-hour shift. Yeah. They don't want to do, it's not healthy for them. It's not healthy for their family. And so now with a greater staff, we can provide a bit more, time in the office, the time to decompress, and time to conclude those reports. And so what I hope to see with ASERT is just that the organization continues to get a bit bigger in terms of staff. So that way we have more hands on deck to get these reports concluded quicker.
All right. Well, and we're kind of coming up to the end of our time here. One thing I wanted to make sure I kind of got an opinion on, or see if you had a viewpoint on it, is have you seen this public database on police misconduct? It was put out by
a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Someone did forward me a bit of details on that.
Do you think there's going to be more of those type of things, and how do those impact? How do they impact ASERT specifically? Because from a police officer standpoint, and I'm just one of many, but to me, these are people offering commentary way after the fact, and then it's some of the stuff's on there is not factually correct. So do you guys worry about any of those kind of things and what people are putting out there? Or is it just, it's more noise with, social media and everything else that's going on?
To be honest, I've never looked at that database. I've only heard about it secondhand. But my main concern right away is, who's actually curating this database? How are they determining they're getting this correct?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have an answer to that in terms of who's actually looking at it in depth and who's making sure that all the facts are correct. As you mentioned, I think we found that facts aren't correct. That's a huge concern. ASERT published its findings in a situation where an officer is charged. That name becomes public because it goes to the court process. So there is that accountability. So I always view that there's already, the public wants to educate themselves. They already have more defined data that's out there in terms of, the legal review board, ACERT's findings, court cases, the media. And so, my fear when I see some sort of a citizen-generated website or database is that, well, it's a free country. People can create the stuff if they want to, but they need to be correct, right? Like, we're talking about people's lives, people's reputations. And so they need to be correct, but it really doesn't have any effect on what ACERT does. We're either directed to investigate or we're not. And if we are directed to investigate, then we go and we do our due diligence and give it 100%. But if we're not directed to investigate, if I saw something that came up in that database, I wouldn't concern myself with it. I know it's a far different aspect to be a police officer named on that database, so it's easy for me to say. But for me, it's just it's not something we've concerned ourselves with. We're just concerned with what we're directed to investigate, what we have a mandate over, and making sure we get it right.
Yeah, and when you look at the databases, you're right on point with saying, like, look at who's generating these or putting the information out. I know a lot of the times you'll see it's just like when you read a news article, everybody's an expert that they talk to, and everybody's got PhD or whatever in front of their name, so they know everything. But they might know a lot, but if you actually look just 1 or 2 degrees into their friends or what they support or the tweets that they retweet or whatever it may be, I think you can find a lot of stuff about people that shows you they're kind of slanted in their view one way or another. So they're not necessarily independent thinkers, and some people have different motivations. But yeah, I appreciate the insight, and definitely have an interesting career. I know you do got to get going here, so we'll kind of wrap it up. But is there anything you think we missed, or anything we should mention before you do have to go?
But aside from just thank you, Nathan, for the invitation to appear on the podcast, and I can tell you, our relationship with EPS and EPA is really, really important to me. So I welcome the conversation, and I can tell you, we're always open to any comments, questions, issues, or criticisms. It's really important to me to keep the communication open because we want to make sure we're getting this stuff right.
Great. Thank you for coming on, and we'll definitely have you on again because there's always something happening in the police world and the ACERT world. So we'll definitely have to get you back on. So I'll wrap it there. If you could just hang on the line, I'll say bye offline, and we'll just stop the recording.
Thanks very much.